We're delighted to host this advocacy webinar from Connecticut Humanities, and we're grateful to have Tony and Joanna on board to share their insights. As many of you know, Connecticut Humanities has been very involved in an advocacy role for funding from the state, and we continue to advocate on behalf of the many cultural organizations, upwards of 800, across Connecticut in every one of our communities. And to do that successfully requires all of your participation. And the message that we're delivering to our legislature and our governor is one that's sort of centered on three core themes: economic impact, educational impact, and social impact. So this is the second of the three focused webinars. We'll have some follow-up content as well. But this is really an opportunity to help you all craft messages for the people you serve, whether it's organizational, with schools, and communicating that effectively to our elected leaders. But I think also more broadly, making sense of the work we do in the communities we serve. In particular, we'll see an opportunity to connect our new curricular frameworks with our cultural organizations. And I think this is going to be an important move that we hope you all help us demonstrate. And just as a reminder, back in 2021, Connecticut Humanities had received nearly $31 million that we were able to then award to those hundreds of organizations. And in part, we received that funding because of the connection we were making between our cultural organizations and our K-12 students and educators. So this is a really important piece that we want to hone in on and ensure that everybody's getting that message and the impact is resonating with us. So again, thank you all for joining. We're delighted to have you all here and to learn from Tony and Joanna. Cindy, I'll hand it back to you.
So as Jason said, we're very excited to have with us today Tony Roy and Joanna Steinberg. Tony is the president of the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies, and Joanna is the director of education at the New Haven Museum. And if I butchered anything, please correct me, guys. But so really, I am going to open the floor to them. We will start with Tony sharing a little bit about what teachers need from folks in the cultural sector and how we can best support the work that teachers are doing in the classroom. And then Joanna has some ideas in terms of what museums are doing and what's working well for them over at the New Haven Museum. So Tony, I'll let you kick it off.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So glad to be here. Just like Cindy was just saying, I'm Tony Roy, President, Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. I've been in this role for coming to the end of my 5th year as the president. And in my day job, all right, so I just moonlight doing this. In my day job, I'm also a classroom teacher. I've been teaching for 15 years. Currently, I'm at the Greater Hartford Academy of the Arts. While I'm talking, if an announcement goes off, I'm really sorry. I am in my school. This is my classroom. And that's just one of the interruptions that sometimes we have to deal with as classroom teachers. Which brings me to my point about, or my first talking point, I guess you could say, about, what is it like in the classroom? I would say that in the classroom, across Connecticut and probably across the nation, there has been, over the last several years, a shift in classroom teaching, moving more towards inquiry instruction. And for folks that are unaware what inquiry instruction is, basically inquiry instruction is having students begin with a question called a compelling question, and following that through the research process. So sure, we're beginning with a question and identifying the different types of sources that we should be working with. There's content acquisition, whether it be in history or geography or economics or civics. And then working with sources, which is something that social studies teachers have been doing for a very long time. And then finally, communicating and taking informed action. So the 4 stages of the inquiry process is something that Teachers have been moving towards probably since about 2015 or maybe even before. So this has been at least 10 years of transition in social studies classrooms. I think that what's wonderful about that is it is increasing how dynamic the classrooms are, right? So classrooms, if you might remember from your days in being in the social studies or history classroom, or even at the college level, there was a lot of filling of cups. Students would listen and take notes, of course, do quizzes, maybe write a couple essays. And really what that looks like is the teacher is really in the driver's seat. And what we're seeing more and more now is we're seeing students a little bit more in the driver's seat. I mean, are they the experts in contents that the teachers are? Most likely not, but they're definitely in a position where they are driving the instruction either through interest, so through their voice, or through their, through making the choices about what they want to learn about, or how they are differentiating in the product that they're creating, or even the process in which they're learning. So there's a little bit more of a student-centered approach, a differentiated approach in the classrooms. This can be really fun for a teacher that is skilled at having students looking at different topics, especially if they're all kind of driving towards like a similar end project, or they're driving towards a similar end goal of understanding maybe a smaller topic within the larger context of history or economics or geography. But also it can be challenging, right? Because, students are, they have their own unique interests. So you have to be able to try to figure out how is it that we can meet those interests. I mean, it's not 100% just go learn whatever you want, of course. I mean, there are guidelines for what we're trying to do here. But at the most part, I would say that it's a dynamic situation in the classroom. Even just today, I mean, I gave notes today, right? We're learning about the Constitutional Convention. I was like, well, we need to get some key points across. I want to make sure that they have these, you know what I mean? So we did some notes for about a half hour. And then I said, okay, now pick one of these issues or one of these topics that we talked about today in class, and let's do a deep dive, right? Pick something and let's go a little bit deeper with that. And then at the end of the class, we're going to share out, what did we learn? So that was just an example of how students are a little bit more in the driver's seat. I would also say that the history classroom, the social studies classroom, it's a little bit fraught. I think that I guess the best way to say it is vigilance is way up, meaning that parents and in some cases administrators are looking a little bit more closely at what teachers are doing in the classroom, what's being taught. Is being looked at, let's say, with a different lens than maybe has been looked at in the past. So teachers have to be aware, constantly aware of how topics are being approached, even something maybe as basic as you would think about maybe sovereignty. The idea of sovereignty could be looked at, at what level does someone have? Is it personal sovereignty, right? We're looking at the sovereignty movement that's been happening lately, parental sovereignty. Are we talking about governmental sovereignty, right? So these ideas that we would think maybe would take for granted as something, very basic, can be, again, under a little bit more scrutiny. So that I just want to just let you think that teachers are dealing with a lot, right? We're dealing with a lot of different disparate needs in the classroom. Students are coming with a lot of different backgrounds in terms of, sure, their educational background. Also, their cultural backgrounds are very, I don't want to say disparate, but definitely varied. So everyone's bringing a little bit something different to the classroom. And I think what kind of helps with that really are the new standards that we passed just in 2023, October 2023. They were adopted by the State Board of Education. There were over 100 educators, many of them classroom teachers, probably over half classroom teachers, that work to figure out, well, first off, what should be in the standards, number one. What should be the principles that kind of guide the standards as we're developing them. And I see someone put that in the chat. Thank you so much. In addition to that, also, what is the content and the skills that we're going to go ahead and include in the standards, because really the standards are going to drive curriculum definitely for the next decade, and probably until we get together and write new standards in the future. So that was actually a really long process. Each grade, K through 12 or K through high school, has a distinct set of standards. Each of the kindergarten through second grade is kind of like a group of standards. 3 through 5 is another group of standards. 6 through 8 is another group of standards. And then again, we have the high school standards, which really cover modern world history and US history and civics and government. The way that we developed, like, what are the content standards for each grade, we really just kind of based it off of the Connecticut frameworks, which were passed back in 2011. And really 90 to 95% of the schools already follow the standards, like the progression of content as outlined in the standards. So if you get a chance to click on that link and you go through and you're like, oh, second grade is, I don't know, me and my community, fifth grade is US history, basically from, let's say, the point of contact through the American Revolution. Eighth grade is US history, basically from, we go back into colonial era a little bit through the Reconstruction, and then high school US history is Reconstruction through the present. Just to kind of give you an idea, most schools were already following that model. So we picked up on that and we continued with that. In addition to that, I want you to think about the standards in two ways. There's the skills, which you're going to find within the inquiry standards, and then there's content, which are in the content standards. And all of this really was derived from the College and Career and Civic Life Framework that was passed by National Council for the Social Studies back in 2013, which was also the basis of the Connecticut frameworks that we had a while back. And basically what we've done is we've developed a way to make sure that we're developing skills throughout the grades. So for instance, a lot of students, this is what I hear anyway, a lot of students say, oh, schools really should teach us how to do taxes. And I think the reason they say that they want us to learn how to do taxes is because what they're really hungry for is economic education, right? They want to know how banks work. They want to know, how is it that I can make a smart move, let's say, with investing, or how is it that tariffs, this is a big thing that we're talking about lately. How do tariffs work, and why is it so much in the news right now? And what we find is, I teach at the high school level, is that it's really hard to help students critique international monetary policy if they don't know what a bank is. So what we've done is we've figured out a way, using the College and Career and Civic Life Framework, to scaffold out the skills for history, economics, geography, and civics throughout K to 12. So that's the skills and also the content knowledge. If you're thinking about, and I'll give you some examples. So for inquiry, I'm going to talk about sources because we have a lot of museum folks here. And I think one thing that museum folks can really help teachers with is accessing relevant sources that are both relevant to the content and also relevant to their locality. So for instance, in second grade, we're thinking about evaluating a source to determine between fact and opinion. Right? That's a very basic skill that we're looking at in second grade. Can we look at a source and can we determine if it's fact or if it's opinion? And this is really helping students thinking about bias in sources later on, right? Because all sources really have some sort of bias. The order of the information is bias. How the names are listed, it has a little bit to do with bias, right? So we're really trying to help students figure out how is it that we can work with sources. When they get to the fifth grade level, they're looking at identifying evidence in response to a compelling question, right? So they have a question they're trying to figure out, and they want to find evidence that helps answer that question, while determining among fact and opinion to determine the credibility of a source. So now in second grade, what's a fact, what's an opinion in the source? Now, like, is this source credible? We're talking about fifth grade. This is an advanced skill. Is this source credible based on the facts or opinions that are found in the source? And then we're going to fast forward. We're going to jump over middle school. It's just one step up. The high school level, what we're aiming at is really organizing and prioritizing evidence in a way from multiple sources, in a way to develop and strengthen claims. right? So you can see how this skill develops over time. So I've worked a lot with museums. We actually did a lot with the New Haven Museum when we did our Summer Institute there this year. We had hopefully you're going to talk a little bit about that, Joanna, because you guys did a wonderful job working with, well, we worked with New Haven Museum to make that happen. And what I would say is one thing that teachers need is they're looking for ways that they can make local connections, right? How can they make their history come alive? You know, I would say that Connecticut in particular, the history of Connecticut is a microcosm of what's happening at the national stage. You could look at the Amistad case, of course. Discovering Amistad is a wonderful exhibit that we have at the New Haven Museum. But you could look at any topic. Today, I was talking about how interchangeable parts really changed the dynamic of what's happening in manufacturing across the world. I mean, that happened right here in Connecticut. I mean, the idea of popular sovereignty, you know, the idea of popular sovereignty kind of has its roots right here in Connecticut. So how is it that we can take a little snippet of what's happening at the national level and show how it's relevant? I mean, because that's what makes it real. That's what gets kids excited. And the unfortunate thing is a lot of times we're not going to be able to make it out to the museum. And we know that museums, especially small and medium-sized museums, have a hard time accepting 100 kids all at once, right? I mean, that's really difficult. So how is it, and this might be a challenge point, how is it that we could, I don't want to say digitize, because that kind of takes away the authenticity of it, but how is it that we can get some sort of a source into the hands of the classroom teacher or into the classroom or into the students' hands? We have to think about that. I remember years ago, and they might still have it, the Connecticut, well, what was the Connecticut Historical Society, which is now the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. They had these boxes that the teacher could like rent out, and it would have like these fake sources in there. I mean, I worked with those a couple times. I think that was pretty good, but that's something I think that teachers could use some help with, is how is it that we can get access to materials that are within your repositories? Because I think that's where the real learning happens. And, you know, I think what's also really important is we have to remember that every time a student has access to a museum, let's say they're able to get to the museum, let's say your museum is, I don't know, well-funded, or you have some sort of a way to get kids into the building. We have to remember that that is creating right there, when you get that point of contact, that's creating future return visits, right? So a kid's going to go in there and say, oh, wow, I went to this museum. I want to go back again. You know, because it's really about exposure. If we can help kids with exposure, they're going to more likely be a return customer. And that's what we need to support the ecosystem. You know, as we know, we're going to be wrestling with education policy for the next couple of years. We're going to be really needing to band together in order to make sure we're supporting the ecosystem of arts and culture. Particular social studies education. We know social studies education is going to be looked at very closely. And if we can get students in the building, we know that families are going to follow, right? And because families are very tuned into what's happening in the classroom, and a kid might come home and say, hey, I went to, you know, the Mark Twain Museum just because it's local in this area, or here at Beecher Stowe Center, you know, and the families might be, well, what'd you learn there? Oh, wow, that's interesting. We'd love to come back. So I think that we have to remember that students are a great way to make sure that we're having folks kind of become repeat customers. And I think that's kind of my time. I've talked kind of a lot. I'd like to, I guess, kick it over to maybe Cindy or Joanna to pick up the next piece.
Joanne, I'll throw it right over to you.
Sure.
Thanks,
Hi,
Tom.
hi, everyone. Joanna Steinberg, Director of Learning and Engagement at the New Haven Museum. Thanks for spending your afternoon all together to be part of this conversation. And I just want to echo so much of what Tony said in terms of inquiry-based approaches and student-centered approaches. It's really at the core of what is happening in the field of museum education. In terms of, you know, thinking about collaboration with teachers and schools, what really drew me to museums in the first place was their potential to provide access, which Tony spoke to, access to cutting-edge scholarship about lesser-known stories, inclusive stories, and often locally relevant ones that provide, you know, face-to-face contact with one-of-a-kind objects and artistic works. They provide truly unique experiences for students and teachers where they're meant to be community spaces, not just repositories, not just preserving and keeping collections, but making them really a center for storytelling and interpretation. And that's meant to be, part of a discussion with students where everyone is involved in that process. So something I've been thinking a lot about is, the future of museum education and how do you measure impact? And the word that really comes to mind to me in this moment is partnerships. Tony, you mentioned really working closely together. And I think, museums historically have measured impact based on attendance and foot traffic. But the goal for me in this moment is really creating meaningful experiences and sustained engagement, where we're working closely with educators, not providing, the one-off experience or presenting content from within the museum walls outwards, but really working closely with teachers to be co-creators of programs, partners, because we have shared, but also reciprocal goals. And I always think that I feel so lucky to work with K through 12 groups because I feel like I see the most range in terms of audience in the city. But when I hear from students and teachers and what they're finding interesting, what they gravitate to, what they hope and expect to see in the museum walls, hearing from them should be transforming the museum, the type of exhibits that we put on, the type of programs we create. So a good example, we were really lucky to work with Connecticut Council for the Social Studies to hold that Curriculum Institute for about 60 to 70 teachers from across the state of Connecticut. We work closely with, New Haven Public Schools and librarians, different CIA meetings that we've held here, the Seedlings Collective, the list goes on and on. So it's really been great to open up the space as just a center for discussion with teachers to share new exhibits and programs, collect feedback, incorporate what they're seeing in terms of program and exhibition development. But I think what's been interesting is we did a partnership with Connecticut Council for the Social Studies that supported our working closely with a local school, the Westwood School, where they had a particular interest in William Lanson. And for those of you outside of New Haven, he was a engineer, an entrepreneur, a leader in New Haven's 19th century Black communities, an advocate for voting rights as early as 1814. And so we have this incredible painting done by a New Haven artist, Ricardo Gutierrez, where students really, through those inquiry-based approaches, interpret the painting together, think about what the artist wants to represent, what he wants to commemorate about his legacy and the networks that Lanson worked with. We provide a map in our library where students kind of learn about the landscape of New Haven. They kind of trace where his businesses were, where he lived, where he died in an almshouse eventually when he was targeted unfairly by law enforcement in New Haven. But then we also walk out to the Farmington Canal. He was instrumental in the building of Longworth and the Farmington Canal. And we see a new statue that was recently commissioned by the Amistad Committee in 2020. So students have a chance to, use those inquiry-based approaches, use art as a springboard for learning about history and, their local communities, and really think about the ways that artists kind of recenter these stories that have been forgotten. Students can compare, the styles of artists, what they most want to uphold and most want us to think about, and then they share their personal perspectives as well. And the conversation's always most rich when we hear from the students. There's obviously clear learning objectives with every program, but my favorite question to ask at the end of each program is, what was your favorite object or artistic work that you saw in the museum? What should we be sure to share with other students when they come and why? And students really like participating in, crafting the program and thinking about what continues to be shared at the museum. In terms of other work that we're doing, we're really excited for this Wednesday evening. We are having our annual meeting at the New Haven Museum, and our keynote speaker will be Julia Miller, who was recently named the Connecticut Teacher of the Year. And she'll be having a conversation with Babs Rawls-Ivy, the Inner City News editor and WNNH host, where she's really going to be speaking to the work that teachers are doing in New Haven, the challenges faced by public schools in our city, but also the social justice education work that she's been doing, particularly in designing a civics and youth justice in practice course and an aspiring educators pathway program for high school students called Educators Rising. So I want to take this opportunity, just because there is common interest in this group, to invite you all. I'm going to throw it in the chat. But this will be this Wednesday evening, Wednesday, December 11th at 6 o'clock. And we really want to celebrate and honor the work that teachers are doing, and hear from Julia and open up a space to have a dialogue about the importance and the power of education now. See, I think the last thing I want to mention, Tony spoke about how we can partner with teachers, what teachers, most want to utilize from the museum, but I want to also bring back students at the center of this conversation. You mentioned student-centered approaches, Tony, which museum educators, I'm seeing like-minded people in this space, know that we're trying to transition from that traditional tour of, providing as much knowledge as we can in an hour-long program, but really centering the voices of students and making sure that the experiences are participatory and involve active learning. So that's not to say that teachers are just facilitators. We expect museum educators to be as immersed in the content so that they can be, fluent and flexible, but to really exercise some restraint too, to really make space for students, to process and to make their own discoveries, their own share reflections, observations, ask questions, and that is what creates the most meaningful experiences. From my own perspective, when I'm hearing from students, they always so beautifully articulate what they're seeing and what they find to be profound. And it's something we all should be listening to and learning from. And I always try to relay that back to my colleagues too, as we think about, future exhibits and what we want to have on the museum's walls. So I know that was a lot. I definitely want to make this a conversation with everyone. So Cindy, I'll throw it back to you.
I'm a mouse for a second. Thanks both Tony and Joanna. This has been great. Before we go over to questions, I want to give Misa an opportunity to introduce herself. Misa is our new Digital Humanities Education Manager at Connecticut Humanities, and we'll be working closely with Tony, Joanna, and other folks in the education sector. So I'll hand it over to you, Misa.
Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, so I'm the new Digital Humanities Education Manager, Connecticut Humanities. Like she said, I'm a former educator, and I'm currently working on our website called Teach It, which is a site for educators by educators that has lesson plans and primary sources on Connecticut subjects for teachers that they can directly use in the classroom. They're all aligned with those social studies standards that Tony had mentioned earlier. And our latest one is actually on William Lanson, who Joanna mentioned. So if you want to check that out, it's pretty cool. So we also have ConnecticutHistory.org, which is our digital encyclopedia, which is a really great resource. So please shoot me an email if you think we can work together or have any ideas on how we can kind of connect as educators.
Thanks, Misa. And then finally, before questions and answers, I'm going to throw in the chat a sheet that we created based on our topic of conversation today. So some of these links here for you, but also in thinking about what we want to be communicating over to legislators. Some of the metrics that we can all be collecting and collating so that we can really measure what the impact we're having on students across the state is. So that includes collecting some quantitative data, the number of students you're serving, the number of teachers, how many field trips you've had, how many outreach programs. but then also that qualitative data, those photographs of students in your space, testimonials from students and teachers. And we will be updating this because I should have added on here evaluations. And I love, Joanna, your idea of really using partnerships to measure impact, because I think it does show how we have all woven this network that works together to do this work. And then just so that people are aware, we also have on this list some of the key legislators, which includes our legislative leadership here in the state and members of the Education Committee. I will say that this list is going to be out of date in a couple of weeks with the new session beginning in January. So we will be updating these materials as we move forward. But keeping in mind, especially if you have any representatives or senators in your district who are on the Education Committee, inviting them to tours, keeping them informed of the work that you're doing, and showing your value within this educational ecosystem. So that is in the chat, and I'll be emailing it out to everybody afterwards. But really, we want to open this up to questions and give everybody an opportunity to have either Tony or Joanna share their experience. So if you'd like to raise your hand or throw a question in the chat, you are more than welcome to.
I would also open it up to folks who might offer particular experiences they've had with connecting curriculum in their educational programming as examples. This doesn't need to be one-dimensional, so could have, multiple voices here offering ideas.
Can I ask a question? I was wondering, so there was, hi, Melissa Houston. I'm newly at Greenwich Historical Society. I was previously at Keeler Tavern Museum over in Ridgefield. And there was discussion in Ridgefield about having a shared experiences and didn't happen, but they exist in Greenwich. And I'm wondering how many school systems, if there's an understanding of how many school systems offer shared experiences, if that's something that's used across the state or just in specific locations.
Can you define what a shared experience is?
Shared experience.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Sorry.
Well, you probably have a better definition than I, but from what I know, an a shared experience means that the central office decides what field trip every single student at a single grade level will have each year. So an assured experience for second grade that's being proposed in Greenwich right now is like a local history type tour. Every single second grader will go to it. It is funded by the schools, the Board of Ed. It is not funded by the individual schools or by parents or anything like that. And the idea is that it creates a baseline across the district so that every student has one educational experiences that's the same regardless of what the PTA can do or what parents can afford. So in Ridgefield, there were a handful of those types of experiences where it was across a grade level, guaranteed. I guess it's more like a guaranteed experience. But in Greenwich, they aim for one at every grade level. And it's a little bit tricky. So I'm wondering if anybody else has experience, if there's other districts that operate similarly.
I can tell you, I'm not sure if I know of any data that says how many districts are doing that. I know that in the district that I work for, correct? They're using that and they have many schools. I mean, there's like 20 or 30 schools. I think one of the shared experiences is going down to New Haven Museum. So you might be getting a lot of CREC folks coming down through there, Joanna. So you're benefiting from that for sure. But I see that happening more and more in schools because they want to make sure that, like you're saying, that economic barriers aren't stopping students from having place-based learning experiences, which I think is a wonderful new kind of addition to the way that people are thinking. But again, I'm not sure how many districts are doing that, but it is something that's growing.
I can say something about Norwalk. Hi, we actually partner with the schools, and we actually offer it for the second grade. For the longest time, it was for the third graders for the Norwalk Public School System, and it is supported by mostly the PTA. It's not mandatory, but we invite all the teachers in the second grade now, because they got moved during the pandemic, from third to second grade to participate. And they thoroughly enjoyed it. But it's a program that the Historical Society has been doing for probably 40 years. You know, we would love to make it mandatory at the school level, but we can't. But we do get schools outside of the Norwalk Public School System who I've got from Bridgeport. We get homeschoolers. So it's something that Greenwich is not alone in trying to do this.
I think my concern, like right now, is trying to navigate the different cultural institutions that exist within Greenwich and not vying for the same grade level that somebody else already has a corner on, if that makes sense. Like the Bruce Museum already has an assured experience for a certain grade level, and I don't want to try and build something that's in direct competition with them necessarily. It's like a weird negotiating of space. You know, we want to provide as many, you know, great experiences, on-site experiences as we can, but then how do you navigate that when your museum has a very specific maybe history or strength or a program, and then there's not that support from the schools in the same way. So I'm trying to figure out how you navigate that in a community that has a lot of potential cultural resources.
I mean, it
I
seems like,
think, yeah,
go ahead, Joanna, please.
Yeah, from the New Haven Museum, you know, Tony, you mentioned that obstacle of what do you do when 100 students need to leave, you know, the building at the same time to share that bus. And something that we've been doing at the New Haven Museum is we reopened our updated Amistad exhibit, but we also now have the Shining Light on Truth exhibit about New Haven, Yale, and slavery, which grew out of the Yale and Slavery Working Group, was co-curated by Mike Morand and Charles Warner Jr., designed by David John Walker. But it's been amazing to kind of pull together our resources, you know, really form these partnerships with other cultural organizations where we kind of team teach and split the groups in half, and groups get to make those connections across institutions. Those two exhibits, because they focus on the abolitionist movements in the 1830s, specifically with a focus on New Haven, they're in direct conversation with each other, and the conversations are that much richer when we have students, you know, engaging with the different partner organizations, learning in different ways, learning from different repositories that really prioritize the story that we're telling and not just collections. So I don't know how spread out the organizations are in your district, but if there's ways to, you know, often when students leave the building, they have half a day, for example, or they might want to do something, have lunch in between and go to another organization. If there's ways to partner across the field to kind of expand on the storytelling, because these collections often inform each other, that to me sounds ideal.
I guess my one comment would be, I guess I have two comments. Number one, I think it's important that cultural institutions try to make whatever connections they can with teachers and schools to be able to build those relationships so that you can foster some sort of a trip. Because remember, you started with shared experiences. That's not the only game in town. That's number one. Number two, I think competition is important among cultural institutions to make sure that we're not just saying, oh, they're going to go to this one museum every year and they have a chokehold on it, right? I mean, if you have something better, that's better with the standards and is better for learning for kids, like, sorry, other museum, but the teacher's going to go where the learning is best. So I think that that's important, that we don't just sit by the wayside and say, oh, well, we're not going to do third grade because this museum down the road has third grade. If your content fits that, then you should make something that works really well, and they should adjust to what you have. I mean, so again, I think just because we're a nonprofit doesn't mean that we're not non-competition. And I think competition is healthy. especially when it comes to student learning, because we only have so many dollars and so much time as teachers to make this happen. So if you got something that's way better, yours is going to be the choice for sure.
Can I? say something? Do you have to put my hand up?
You're already going. Go ahead.
I'm in the dark. Sorry about that. I just want to say that I'm from Woodbridge, from the Emmett and Woodbridge Historical Society. We have a really nice historic museum and a one-room schoolhouse. And our third graders come every year, and every year they have a great idea, a great time. Most of us are just flat-footed when it comes to teaching second grade, and we're doing it, just what works and what doesn't work, by trial and error. If we had access to ideas from other institutions, historical societies, anybody who's got a good idea about how to teach second graders, we know what we've discovered they like, but we could always have a lot more ideas to their advantage. So I would invite anybody who's in a similar situation and would like to trade ideas to get in touch.
I'll tell you, I can speak to that just a little bit. We had a wonderful program sponsored by Connecticut Humanities where we were able to work with museums and teachers to create like a school museum partnership. And what we did was we facilitated the schools, like teachers from the school and the museum educators to get together and develop programming that seemed to make the most sense for what they're going to be teaching in the classroom. So the teachers were able to say, hey, this is what's going to work with our students because this is what we're doing in our learning progression and this is the time of the year they're coming in. And so again, I really think it comes down to building those relationships. If you could somehow get a relationship with a teacher that's teaching second grade and say, hey, we'd love to have you come in for an afternoon and we'll give you some pizza or, a couple $100 or something like that if you have it. And so we'd love to help you develop something that would work. I think that that's a tremendous way to build those connections. Because again, you're going to get that repeat customer because if you have something that's really tailored to what the school's trying to do and it's really working, they're going to come back year after year. That's what we're finding with this program that we do.
Yeah,
with
we do that.
Humanities.
We do that. We have close relations with the third grade teachers. Yeah.
Great.
So
So
we've
ask those
got
third
that
grade
going, but,
teachers.
how to use our collections, what we can do that doesn't expose our collections to inappropriate handling by second graders, because we don't want to go anywhere near that. We make a big point of letting them touch things if we possibly can. And, as you say, experiential learning to the extent possible. But of course, we have responsibilities for the well-being of the collection too. So it's a balance. And if other people we've been doing some pretty clever things, and I would be very happy to share those too. But generally speaking, they show up and you go, oh my gosh, here they are again. What am I going to do?
There is always that delicate balance between interpretation and preservation, right? Because we always have a bifurcated mission in museums, right? So how do we make that happen? That's a great point.
But we all have a good time, so it works out.
Sounds like the tactile opportunities sound best for the younger learners, but really everyone loves it. What works for the youngest students tend to work for all museum visitors because having everything behind cases and off limits, everyone wants to interact in some kind of deeper way. So, I often think folks in collections think that having touch objects gives mixed messages, but it often makes it clearer, what can be touched and then what do we appreciate as a one-of-a-kind object that has to be cared for. I think having both experiences really help.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we feed them too. That really helps.
Great.
They churn butter and then they eat it, that kind of thing. Food always works. Tip number 1 for everybody, not just second graders.
Tony, you mentioned providing access to materials from the collections, beyond that hour or a 90-minute program that students come for. I just want to call out that when we updated our Amistad exhibit, some of our project advisors were also educators on our staff who also work in the New Haven Public Schools. And so Eve Galanis made this website. I just want to also share it in the chat, that provides access to a lot of what's, on the museum's walls. So it can be used as a preview to make sure students are excited about what they're going to see at the museum, but it also allows them to unpack conversations later and to recall information, to look deeper if anything was missed, and to really just have access to those visuals and storytelling. So I just wanted to share that creating websites that teachers can use beyond the walls of the museum has been really great. I have a question for Cindy and Jason in particular, but I've been thinking really about how do you best measure impact? Where, recording attendance and broad reach is important, but how do you measure, what is the criteria for documenting, sustained engagement with teachers? Something I've been thinking about lately is we often see teachers after they come to the professional learning session, the one-on-one meetings that we're able to have with teachers, to really think about how do we best embed this in the curriculum, but also being flexible. Like there's a lot of schools with bilingual learners who have asked for key vocabulary ahead of time. There are schools that want to do scavenger hunts because they know that works best for their students to have them move around the space. So really thinking about customizing experiences. Through that partnership that Tony mentioned, where we created that program about William Lanson, it's now embedded in our roster of field trips. But it's also really nice to take the opportunities to always be willing to create something new with any educator who, best knows their students and what's going to work in your museum.
I'll start and then I'll pass it over to Jason. But I think one thing that would be great is kind of collecting a couple of sentences from some of these teachers. Because I do think sharing testimonials are great. And it doesn't have to be recorded, though that is great as well. But just having in a teacher's own words, a short documentation of that relationship that you were able to build with them, it is a great way to show how you in particular, museums in general, are responding to the situations that these teachers are faced with day in and day out, and what the value add is for the cultural sector in this bigger picture. I think that's easier because everything else is so case by case, which makes it harder to say X number of museums created X new programs to respond to teachers. Do you have anything, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a moving target right now. I think what excites me the most is thinking about, the constellation of stories about Connecticut's people, places, and ideas that most of the public has no clue about. I tend to, in the past, I've asked my staff who have monitored the use of ConnecticutHistory.org to just give me some highlights on, what are the top 5 or 10 Connecticut stories that people are searching out. And it's kind of always the same thing. It's Amistad, it's Sikorsky, it's Mystic, it's those kinds of things. And I think we're missing a real opportunity to build those kinds of connections, those relationships that Tony and Joanna are talking about, that connect our educators with our cultural organizations, to really open up what those stories are and excite our students and excite our teachers to discover and inquire. I think I know Connecticut's history is at the center of so much agency and ideation in this country into a national narrative that we can really sort of grapple onto local stories and make them relevant nationally versus grabbing at national stories and trying to figure out where to make them local. And I think if we can sort of build these bricks in our foundation, so to speak, of relationships between our educators and our organizations, to uncover those, to uplift them, and to communicate them within our families, within our communities, to our elected leaders. Those are the things that I think are going to continue to be the seeds that get us to where we need to go. I mean, we can cite the number of visits and so on, but I think at the end of the day, connecting kids to ideas and being generative in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's probably a bad trope to lean on, but Yankee ingenuity is not nothing. Or Connecticut Yankee ingenuity is not nothing. And I think we need to sort of think about that and how it's applicable today, especially when you have a governor and a legislature that are thinking about the innovation economy, biotech businesses coming into Connecticut. How do we connect those dots? How do we prepare the sort of knowledges that are required to do those kinds of things? How do we seed that ground in our schools today? And who knows where kids are going to go? But if we're not sort of influencing their ideas and giving them the ground to plow, to keep up with that metaphor, I think we're missing a real opportunity. So there's quantitative and there's qualitative, and I think we can cite all sorts of qualitative and miss out like why it matters at the end of the day, and why Connecticut Humanities and why Connecticut Council for the Social Studies and why New Haven Museum are really thinking concretely about like getting this into the hands of kids and educators.
One thing that I've tried to do is get all of the numbers in the paperwork that teachers send when they set up a field trip. And then I do an exit survey. It's sent out to all teachers after their visit. And that's where we usually collect information about like those one-liners that teachers have to say. But I also put out there some of the things that we perceive as important in our school programs, like includes local history, is age appropriate to the grade level that visited. And I asked teachers to rate those and importance of why they visited for this particular field trip. And that's been really helpful to kind of see why is it that teachers are seeking us out? What are the things that are important to them for planning field trips or coming to field trips or choosing which field trips they're doing? So it's not, I don't get a lot of responses, but if at the end of the year I've got 10% of teachers' responses, it's still something more than I can react to or something that we can use.
I actually provide those evaluations to teachers as I'm concluding the program, because I think sometimes we miss receiving them in email threads and they're back in their classrooms and have a lot going on. So sometimes when the students are sharing those, profound reflections at the end, it's nice to have the teacher really capture that in the moment. Just to echo what Jason said, some students in our Shining Light on Truth program who were learning about local leaders and individuals in New Haven, advocacy for what would have been the first Black college in the nation that was obstructed in New Haven. Students at the end of the program shared that what they found most important during their time here is that they learned stories about what didn't happen in history. And also that they learned new names that have never appeared in their many years in elementary, middle, and high school, that this was the first time they were gathering, the names of local people who did really important things in our community. But I don't know how to capture that. It was said in person. I can write it down. I'm wondering if maybe we should start doing exit slips in our program for students, though I don't want to, put them to work when they're just processing and thinking through discussion. But how do you capture, the student experiences as well as the teachers? It's always been a question of mine. And Tony, do you know what guidance you would give us for that in terms of, what's feasible for documenting, what students take away, what comes up later in the classroom, not just in the moment.
Well, I'll tell you, what's important to remember about, and I think everyone already knows this, but what's important to remember about museum visits or cultural institution visits is that there should be for students some work that happens before, right? There should be the experience when they go to the actual museum, and then there should be some work that's happening afterwards. That's really how you're going to get a not authentic, but like a really high quality experience with any cultural institution. So if you are able to either create on your own, sounds like some folks are already doing that, or work with a teacher to say, oh, here are some post-experience activities, and you can work into there some questions or activities that will garner some responses from students authentically that the teacher could then collect and send back or take a sample of and send back. You could definitely use that as part of any sort of reporting measurement that you need to do either to a funder or to your board. I think you could get some really nice nuggets, if you will, to share with folks. So again, before, during, and after visit experiences would be, or activities would be a great way to prime, to engage, and then to learn from the students.
Tony, and I think that's really important for expanding the nature of the relationship. Right? I mean, then it's just more than just that that moment. It's extending across the spectrum of experience.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that cultural institutions are tight on time and resources in order to do all of these things. It seems like maybe Connecticut Humanities might be able to have a working group that comes together with maybe 7 or 8 cultural institutions that want to learn a little bit more about this, and they can work together to come up with maybe a template that they could send out to other groups. So there could be some way to kind of build that, because you got to think about how is it that we can do this with the least amount of investment. Time, sure, we might have some time, but do we always have the knowledge to be able to do it? Maybe not. But I think collectively, the community is strong, and I think that we could come up with something that could work for everyone.
Yeah, it's certainly something, I mean, given the work we've done together, Tony, it's something that we find value in and would like to continue to do. Given our more limited resources now, it's a little bit more challenging, but it doesn't mean we can't or won't do it. I think having that dialogue, certainly reaching out to our digital humanities team and continuing the conversation, and even bringing it to our grants team, maybe a couple of pathways we can think through this with those of you who are interested.
Yeah, I mean, funding can be tough, but convening is something that is maybe not as valuable as $1, but convening is something that's really important. And I feel that Connecticut Humanities plays a really important role, as everyone knows here, to be able to do that. Maybe not as an umbrella organization, but definitely as a guiding organization. So I look forward to seeing what that turns out to be.
Yeah, thanks, Tony.
Well, we are past time, so I'm gonna say thank you very, very much to Tony and Joanna for your time, for sharing your knowledge with folks, and to everyone else for participating today. We are excited to have everybody here, and as I said before, we'll be sending out the recording and other materials as we move forward. But along the way, if you have any questions, please let us know. And Tony and Joanna, are you okay if I share your emails in case folks want to reach out directly?
Please do. You can also reach out to the Connecticut Council for Social Studies. Go right on our website. You'll find all the contact information you need.
Thank you all, and have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.